Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I hope you're all staying safe and healthy during this unique time. Partners for Sacred Places is grateful and excited that you've all chosen to spend an hour of valuable time with us for today's presentation, Stewardship, Triage, and Recovery, Strengthening Giving During and After a Crisis. My name is Joshua Castano, and I'll be serving as the moderator for today's webinar. The slides and a recording of today's webinar will be available early next week. Look for an email from partners then, or check our website. For many of us, Zoom webinars are likely a relatively new experience. So I just want to go over a couple of features that will be important and will help make your participation in today's session really great. Only myself and our panelists will have access to video and microphones. However, I'd like to point out two functions that we invite you to use during this session. If you hover your cursor over the screen, you'll see a small speech bubble icon right in the lower part, typically. Click that bubble and a chat box should pop up on the right side. Please use the chat box to introduce yourselves and your congregation. And throughout the webinar, you can use the chat box to engage others and make comments about the discussion. We have set aside time after the presentation for questions and answers. This is a really important part of today's webinar, and we really hope you get to participate. If you have a question that you'd like the panelists to answer, please use the Q&A box. This is a different box from the chat box, and you'll see likewise a small icon on the bottom. If you hover your cursor, it'll say Q&A, and that box will pop up. It'll look a little different from the chat box. You can write your own questions or comment and like others' questions. Also, please note, during the webinar, our presenters will not be on video, but we will return to video once we get back to the questions and answers following the main presentations. So let's talk a little bit about who Partners is and our presenters today. I'd like to welcome our president, Bob Yeager, who's also the co-founder of Partners, who'll be here as a special guest for today's session, but will not be part of the main presentation. Bob is the co-author of Sacred Places at Risk and Strategies for Stewardship and Active Use of Older and Historic Religious Properties. He's also the author of Sacred Places in Transition, a groundbreaking national study, and was the editor of Inspired, a bi-monthly magazine with news and technical articles on religious property preservation. We're also joined today by Gianfranco Grande, Executive Vice President here at Partners, who will be one of our lead presenters. Gianfranco Grande brings over 25 years of experience in the management of nonprofit organizations and capital campaign fundraising to his role. He was awarded the Richard Nickel Award from the Institute of Architects, Illinois, and over the last 20 years, he has successfully helped to raise over $80 million. In 2014, Gianfranco was inducted into the Board of Sponsors of Martin Luther King Jr. College of Ministers and Laity at Morehouse College. He is past board chairman of the Candles Holocaust Museum and Education Center, and a past member of the Board of Trustees of the Council for a Parliament of the World's Religions. Gianfranco, would you like to say anything and say hi to everybody today?
Thank you, Joshua, and thank you, everybody, for being part of this conversation that we know how important it is nowadays.
We're also joined today by Sarah Jones, project manager here at Partners for Sacred Places and consulting services coordinator. Sarah holds a Master's of Divinity from McCormick Theological Seminary, as well as a Master of Social Service Administration from the University of Chicago. Sarah brings experience designing and implementing service programs for returning citizens through the Safer Foundation in Chicago. And Sarah has also held internships with the Southwest Organizing Project and the International Organization for Adolescents. Sarah is also an active member of the University Church of Chicago, where she recently completed a term as moderator of the congregation. Kudos, Sarah, for your service. Anything you'd like to add and say hi to today's participants?
Yeah, I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad to enter them into this conversation.
Great. Thanks so much, Sarah. And I'm Joshua Castano again, Director of Community Engagement Services here at Partners for Sacred Places. I come to Partners from work in historic preservation and community development, beginning my career in Paterson, New Jersey, working with congregations there and helping to implement Partners for Sacred Places training programs for an ecumenical cohort of churches. Glad to be here and really excited about the work that we're going to accomplish during today's webinar. I'd like to just say a couple of brief words about Partners for Sacred Places if you're not familiar with us. We know that many of you likely are, but just as a little reminder, I want to say something about Partners and the work that we do. We were founded in 1989 and continue to be the nation's only non-sectarian nonprofit focused on the issue of supporting and helping congregations steward their historic religious properties. This is the center of our work, and in over 30 years of service across the country, we've developed a number of programs, conducted a wide array of research, and helped both communities of faith and the secular community come to understand the value of these historic religious places and find ways together to preserve them. Over the course of our work, we've had a few themes emerge that have been really important to what we do. Of course, building care and stewardship is paramount, but also community engagement, helping congregations and communities learn how to make the most of these really valuable historic sacred places. Of course, through our work over 3 decades, we've developed a range of training and capacity building techniques and resources that we help congregations use and utilize to do the best and to make the most of their buildings. And lastly, we bring all of this together in an approach that we call community-wide fundraising. We really believe that because congregations and their historic sacred places are assets, are community assets with public value, that this should lead them into an approach that leverages resources from a wide network of allies, friends, and supporters beyond just the members of the congregation. So with that, I'd like to turn the presentation over to my colleague, Gianfranco Grande, who will get us started talking about this really important topic, stewardship in a time of COVID-19. Gianfranco?
Thank you, Joshua. Yes, indeed. This is an extraordinary time where our concern is not only about the health and the well-being, clearly, of our friends and loved ones, but also how can we sustain our activities, our work. So we understand how important it is for you all that are listening. How can we really look at healthy stewardship in this time of crisis? And in fact, that's the first things that we really would like to discuss is about the general picture for a moment, what it was before this dramatic and unexpected pandemic. So the Giving USA Institute tells us that up to 2018, we're given in this country for philanthropy, the outstanding number of 427 billion with a B. But interestingly enough, I want to point out that the most relevant number here is the gift coming from individuals. It's about equal to 77% of this big pie of the 427 billion. So foundation and corporate giving followed far away. And remember, individuals are always the most important source of direct philanthropy. And one of the things, people always ask me, how should I do this? How can we do these things? In my opinion, and in the opinions of our work and the experience that we have learned, that you need to be open and transparent. Always, of course, we advocate for transparency and openness all the time. But really now, at this particular time, my first advice to you is really be open about your financial situation. Try to talk about your your challenges, the challenges that you have. And we all know that it's uncomfortable for many talking about money. It's not an easy subject, but now is important that we put aside our modesty and whatever preconceived notions that we have, and we really do talk about money. So publishing financials, for instance, in the newsletter or in your bulletin, I think is really, really important as well to have finally open finance committee. Let people to know what are your needs, and let people to be part of the conversation, because it's important for everybody. And this is just a little bit of basic principle, but I want to ask my colleague Sarah to tell us a little bit how manage healthy stewardship from a faith perspective, so a little bit different.
Thank you, Gianfranco. And I'm going to ask a little bit of grace as we're experiencing some technical difficulties here. So I think in interpreting giving as a spiritual discipline, this quote from Pope Francis says it all. For those of you joining by phone, the quote is, "I ask you to ensure that humanity is served by wealth and not ruled by it." And all of our faith traditions have a lot to say about money, some of it very explicit. Congregations with healthy giving cultures don't shy away from talking about money. They talk about its proper place in our lives and the kind of priorities we should have for distributing or investing our individual wealth. All of the scriptures have some beautiful language about financial generosity and how it makes a better world possible. And that's an extremely important function of faith communities, to help people have a healthy and generous relationship with money. And it's up to the leaders of the congregation to emphasize that giving is a spiritual discipline so that it becomes a joy and an act of faithful response. And your traditions and judicatories will have an abundance of resources for how you can do this in your own congregation. And we've started to see a lot of articles from them on how to continue that interpretation, specifically in response to COVID-19. And I want to turn it back over to John Franco to talk a little bit about how to communicate your need and gratitude and impact.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. So as we were talking about the importance to be honest and open and transparent about your financial situation, the perfect segue, something that you really must do, is really communicate your need. Ask your benefactors, ask your donors, ask your congregants and your friends, really what is that you need. I think it's very important that we put modesty and timidity aside in this time and say that you need a certain amount of money so that you can keep the doors open, even if only metaphorically speaking right now. But also share not just the need, but talk about the impact that those gifts are and this contribution are going to have in the life of your congregation and in the life of the people that you serve in the wider community, as well as explain and say thank you and really show your gratitude. Never like now is an important thing. And remember those three mantras that partners uses all the time. First, you won't get milk from a cow by sending a letter. In other words, don't send a letter, but if you need something, ask directly and ask in person. A dollar is not just a dollar. There is a value that goes beyond the financial value of the gift, but it's a transformational gift and really can change the life of many, both in a practical and in a spiritual way as well. And then more you love your donors and more they love you back. More you show your gratitude and appreciation and understanding of what is their situation. For instance, if you had a big donor that now cannot make a gift of the same kind they used to be understanding of that and still show your gratitude. And especially to those that cannot give and their situation is changed, make them feel they are still part of your family and your family of benefactors. That's, I think, is extremely, extremely important. So now we're going to look at some of the challenges that we are facing now, the current challenges that we have. I really invite you to look at this very carefully because it's really, really important. And the vast majority of individual donations happen during the worship services. It's an unbelievable number. It's an incredible number, 78%. So, but now we don't have worship services in person. It's been already, I believe, 5 or 6 weeks. The congregations are meeting virtually far away. So we know that there's been a drop in the level of the donations that congregations, the parishes, and a community of faith are experiencing now. So it's important that we keep in mind that we need to do things in a different way. We have seen, and I believe today number is another 4.4 million of Americans have applied for unemployment, and is increasingly in a fast way, and is about 20%, is over 20%. Which is important because the donation that happen on Sunday, so the regular stewardship, the regular giving, doesn't come from asset, so from stocks and so forth, but come from income. So you have fewer people that are, so actually you have lots of people that are hurt by the financial situation, so their giving clearly is less. And places like stock market and investment situations are extremely volatile right now. We have seen just in the last few days this oil situation that is making a already dramatic and complicated financial scenario even more difficult. So we need to keep in mind all these things. So those are the challenges that we are facing. But there are things actually that we can do. So maybe we have to start, we should start looking at what we call emerging best practices. And in fact, I'm asking now Joshua, my colleague and friend Joshua, to tell us a little bit about these emerging best practices. Joshua?
Great, thanks so much, Gianfranco. So this is the part of the presentation where we really want to kind of get into some of the strategies and techniques that might be really helpful. Of course, recognizing that the landscape and situation is going to be different for lots of your congregations based on where you are in the country and how the public is handling the situation and what public guidance is there that's coming out from the public agencies that you have to follow. But we want to get into some of these helpful techniques. The first one, and this really builds on something that Gianfranco has already said earlier in this presentation, is transparency. Transparency. And to add to that, clarity and specificity. These are really key things. So first off, don't panic. Don't panic. We will make it out of this. We have each other, and we have lots of assets. This is the time to really embrace asset-based thinking and remind ourselves that we've got people with talents and expertise and passion, and we've got a lot of other kinds of assets all around us. This is the time where we can deploy them and connect them. So staying connected and working with each other will help us not panic. Another thing is to be honest and to be confident. You need to know the urgency and the extent of your need, and you need to be able to communicate that effectively. How can you describe it in a way that's clear, that's easy for members and friends to understand, and is really accurate and up to date? Don't be shy of actually publishing or describing the shortfall you're facing. This is not the time to not describe in the detail that you need. This is the time to let people know. They have to really understand. They need to know where they fit in, because you need to ask them. This is where you really want people to be able to see what is the specific financial challenge we're facing, and what's my opportunity as a member or a friend, someone who supports and cares about this place, to fit in and to do my part to help fill this gap. So that's the thing that you need to do. Really be clear about the financial challenges, the amount that's needed. To say a little bit more about how we ask, I'm going to invite Gianfranco to step back in and say something about that.
Yes, Joshua, thank you. It's so simple. It's easy. Ask for what you need. Yes, ask for what you need. If you need a certain amount of money to meet your budget, then ask for that. Don't dance around. Don't prance around. Don't pretend that is not the case. If you need a certain amount of dollars, do ask for that amount of dollars. It's very, very important. I invite you, though, to be also clear about the specific needs that you have. It might be that you have to maintain the staff salary and wages, including, and don't forget them, please, the hourly worker, the invisible one, the one that, make sure that the churches and synagogues and temples are open, are clean, are safe, and so forth. So ask their needs, ask specifically for whatever needs you have. Sometimes it's assistance for important ministry that your building is housing. For instance, just think if you have some, children care type of situations, and now they can't be there in the building because children, and we are not only children, but everybody is not allowed to gather together. Well, that school probably is suffering financially. And so it's important that you become an active partner, if you can, to some degree of whatever is possible to sustain this ministry and this partnership that you have developed over the years. And clearly, this is a time of crisis, and you might ask for specific support for the COVID-related assistance that can be in your congregation as well in your community. And being a voice and a voice of support for both your congregation, the people that are working for you, and the wider community around you, I think is extremely important. But again, ask for what you need. If you need $25,000 to make sure that you get over this situation, trying to find those $25,000 and ask and give the details reason for which you are asking that kind of money. And this is, obviously this is just the beginning of this, and we'll be happy to give more, ideas and suggestions in other sessions. But I think also that we have to look, how can we be comfortable with this new world, right, Joshua? The world is changing. What you can tell us about it?
That's right. Thanks, Gianfranco. So the world is changing, and it has changed. It has changed because we know that most congregations have some kind of online giving option. But what I really want to talk about in terms of that is getting into the 21st century. That's where we are now. We need to get into the 21st century. We know that lots of congregations have digital giving options, but they are woefully underutilized. So this is a tool that everybody, I think, probably says, the chatter in the background probably emphasizes this. Oh, we need to do online giving. We need to do online giving. We really need to transition to this. But really, how effectively are we making that transition? Well, I can tell you this time of crisis is the perfect time to make a huge push. Why can't this be one of your main ministry priorities in the next few months? Why can't this move up the list from something we know we've got to do to actually the number one thing that we've really got to invest in making happen right now? This is really critical, obviously, because we can't gather in person. We can't pass the plate to one another in our comfortable pews that we miss sitting in on Sunday morning. So we need to provide this option. So I want to mention something else. A lot of people share questions constantly. We get this very often. What's the right tool that we need to use? The tools vary. Many of them are similar enough that there's a little bit of difference, but not enough to have us necessarily say that we want to recommend one versus the other. What's much more important than which tool it is, because they're pretty similar, is how are you implementing it, how are you managing it, and how are you following up with your members? So if you're going to make sure that people use your online giving option, what's your plan and strategy? What's the people plan and strategy for this? Do you have staff or trained volunteers who are familiar enough with the system that they can answer questions? Are you anticipating questions that people might ask? Are you sending out information to help people get online with typical Q&A about how to do that, anticipating those questions that they may ask? Do you have maybe some mentors or Sherpas in your congregation who can help older members or those who are less familiar with technology make the transition and move? I'll share a story. It may sound funny to some people, but I think this is a really great effort and is totally in line with the right spirit. And that was one church printed out directions, mailed them, that's right, mailed them, snail mailed them to an older member. Once she got them, had her call them on the phone, and as she sat in front of the computer with the printed out directions, they walked her through how to get set up and how to get familiar with the system. That may seem like a lot of work, but this is a time to put in that kind of work. And it may be an outlier example, of course, but I think it speaks to what's the plan to actually help people move into this. The other thing is make sure to talk about it everywhere. That digital giving is there, but it's in the background. It's not front and center. So you need to move up your transition to online giving or your focus on online giving right into all of your communications, your newsletter, your announcements, all the ways that you're communicating and staying engaged with your members. The other thing that's really critical is, because we don't have that moment during worship now to give and pass the plate, is can you create a moment or a ritual around giving and stewardship and generosity? Maybe it could be during your online streamed worship where you ask people to follow the link and you post the link in your Facebook Live feed so that they can do it right during the offertory during your service, or you have a special message that goes out weekly reminding people to give. But however you do it, make a moment and put a spotlight on generosity and stewardship and giving. That's really critical stuff for right now. In fact, I want to ask Sarah to jump in here and say a little bit more about how giving continues to be so essential to the way that congregations respond during this crisis.
Thank you, Joshua. So one of the hardest things for me, and I think for a lot of us right now, is this feeling of powerlessness to meet the enormous and growing need that we're seeing. And social distancing rules out a lot of the kinds of support we usually would give. And a lot of the really active members of our congregations are in that higher risk age bracket. So that means we don't want them volunteering anywhere other than their homes. But what we can still do is give. In fact, monetary donations are the best forms of aid right now. So making sure that a pledge, a tithe, or offering is made in full and on time is a way to help. It's going to be up to faith leaders, the finance team, the worship team to really communicate that. And we've heard of some congregations turning their general benevolence funds into specifically a COVID relief fund, both for their own members and for the community, and that really helps to drive home that message. We've seen some faith communities talk explicitly about members who are still employed, maybe donating part or all of their stimulus checks to the church. And I want to lift up the impact that people's generosity is having right now. You're able to keep paying staff. You're able to keep providing congregational activities online. You're able to help members who may have lost their jobs. So let your members know that they are still making a difference and that they are part of the relief effort by giving. And probably the most important thing to keep doing right now is to serve. Continue to do the good work that is part of your mission as a faith community. Remember that fundraising is a ministry because it makes other ministries possible. People need to know that their faith community is responding and adapting to this crisis in your community, whatever that need looks like right now. What you don't want to do is press pause on any of your ministries and activities. People still need religious education, they still need fellowship opportunities, they still need spiritual care and worship. And it's really important to promote and publicize the great work that your congregation is doing so that your members know the real world impact of their financial gift. And so that the community around you sees that your congregation is part of the relief effort. And I know that this has been a lot of information, and the clergy who are attending this webinar probably feel really overwhelmed right now. Y'all have had to adapt to this situation really quickly, and everyone is looking to y'all for direction. And so we would encourage you to look at your lay leaders to help adapt your existing ministries and fundraising strategies, or maybe start new ones in response to the crisis. So be specific not only when you're asking for donations, but requests for other kinds of help as well. Your members are creative. They have energy and time, and often they're really just looking for a blessing or for your permission to offer their ideas and talents. The clergy aren't in this all alone. And so I'll turn it back over to John Franco now to summarize what we've discussed and prepare for our Q&A portion.
Thank you, Sarah. Well said. So before we conclude the speaking portion of our webinar today, remember these things. So keep following the best practice for healthy stewardship. It's simple, but it's necessary. So we need to practice really a serious financial transparency. Let's everybody understand what's your financial situation. Communicate your need, communicate your impact, and share the gratitude and say thank you. Emphasize that giving is a faithful action. Like Sarah said, fundraising is really a ministry because it allows other ministry being possible. Finally, Joshua suggests us to step into the 21st century. So let's do it. Let's adapt to this new reality of online engagement. It can be really what has saved many congregations. So integrate the digital giving into your congregational culture. Be creative if you have, but just do it. Make, ask, and celebrate the generosity of on every platform that you have, the newsletter, the website, the social media, at the end of the virtual service that you have on Sundays. Do say thank you, do celebrate. Let's never forget that joy is an important part of our life, and it should be also in a dark moment. Above all, don't panic. There is no reason to be afraid. We have seen a lot of crises, we have seen a dramatic moment, but we know from our parents, our grandparents, for ourselves, at the end of the tunnel, there is always the light. And even this time will be the same. So ask for what you need with the confidence that members will step up. I always seen this over and over again. And I'm always blessed and surprised also by the generosity of people. Recruit lay people, like Sarah suggests us, to do some of the work. Clergy, you can't do everything. Let it go and let other people, maybe the one that are not part of the famous committee of your church, to really take a position of leadership. You might find new resources, but also you can find new leaders among your people. And above all, of course, keep serving your congregation, your people. The flock has been assigned to you, as well the community. The community is around your building, and that makes you the center of this community.
Thank you so much, Gianfranco, for summarizing this presentation and all these great points. I'd like to turn it over now to our question and answer portion. So we do have a Q&A box. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you should see an icon that has a couple of what look like chat bubbles, if you remember the comic strips. And that will, if you click on that, that will lead you to the Q&A box where you can input questions there to share for our panelists to answer, which we're looking forward to. We love answering questions. Let's see any here right now. So I would just ask, while we're waiting for some of our folk to share some of the questions that they might have on their mind, Gianfranco, are there any other specific stories or strategies, and Sarah, please jump in too, that you've heard in your conversations with congregations across the country that you might want to share with folk? I know some of these anecdotes can be so rich and really helpful for other people to hear about.
Yes, it's the general theme right now is really that there is this psychological block at the beginning. We are now into the 6th or so week of this emergency, and after the first sense of, maybe at first we didn't believe it was so serious, and then there is the confusion, what are we going to do, and now there is the anxiety about the future. So I think that more than an anecdote or a story, I want to share that the sentiment has been the same across the board. And finally, we realize that things happen and sometimes they're bad things. So, but I see, Joshua, there is some questions lining up. So,
yeah. So, Sarah, did you want to add anything before I get into these questions?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I've been hearing with some congregations, and this kind of gets back to the transparency of need and some different strategies around that, is there have been some very open conversations about what people are going to do with their stimulus checks if they are still employed, right? So the people who are lucky enough to still be employed, they're still being employed at their full salary. Churches and small businesses and nonprofit organizations are having that conversation about, is there a possibility to donate that money instead of keeping it for themselves and, having that, because they're still able to pay their bills. So I think that is a conversation that we really shouldn't be afraid of having. Yeah.
Great. Thanks so much to both of you. So we've got some really good questions here. Starting from the beginning, I think there's a great question here from Joan McGowan. From Terry Hunter. Sorry. Starting with Terry's question, actually, and I'll answer Joan's separately. But Terry's question is about budgeting for next year in light of so many unknown factors. So any tips or thoughts about that?
Yes, and I want to say hi to my friend Terry. Hi, Terry, and thank you for your question. My suggestion is to really have plan A, plan B, and plan C. Design different budgets, and try to look at the different options and situations that, your beautiful congregation is facing down there. So my suggestion is obviously that you are not going to have the same probably budget that, you were expecting in, at the very beginning in January for next year. But look at, a budget, maybe plan B would be a reduction of 75%, and plan C, a reduction of 50%. Be extremely prudent how you do this type of calculation. the hardest time, it might be the first 6 months of 2021. It might be. We don't know yet, but it might be. So my first advice is that.
Great. Thank you, Gianfranco. And then we have two related questions here. One from Drew Henry, our good friend in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and also one from Paul Pintark. And both of these questions are somewhat related here. They both address the concern about how to help mentor older members, especially because older members, in terms of online giving, because older members might have some very valid and important concerns about their information, their private and financial information. Of course, this is a population that is often taken advantage of. So that is part of the background here. So what are some recommendations about helping mentor older members, especially in light of their concerns about their private financial information and going online? And Paul's question is very similar about private information and bank account and credit card info, et cetera.
Yes, about that, I don't know. I'm sure, Sarah, you have some suggestion. But clearly, when I say disclose your financial, don't do it with strangers, and don't put it, your bank account or the number of your credit cards or whatever it might be for everybody. Exercise always the right amount of prudence. I think it's important, for instance, that you have those finance committee where you might discuss certain things open. And so that's maybe is a place, so when we suggest to have openness in terms of financials, is not disclosing ways that, your account number and that kind of things, but rather your need, okay, your necessities. So be always careful, be always prudent. I don't want you get attacked by hackers and that kind of thing. So there are ways to be always prudent. Basically, do what you do for your own personal finances. You don't put things that can be predated by the criminals that are always lurking in the dark. So just use common sense when you do that. But you can have conversations. You can talk to people on the phone. And you can tell things. And so that's maybe things that you want to consider.
Yeah, and I'll talk a little bit about, I have a grandmother who's almost 90 years old, and she won't sign up for anything online, right? She's not going to give her credit card information out there, which I respect, right? I would suggest that you have conversations with those older members about what would make them comfortable, what kind of security they need. There are some older members who are never going to feel comfortable with PayPal. They're never going to feel comfortable with any of these other platforms. But often they will feel comfortable going straight through their bank, right? So there's always ways to go through their bank to do like automatic withdrawals, right? And you can set that up with them, and they usually trust their bank. So I would explore that with the different banks that your congregation members are a part of, and see if you can set up some kind of automatic withdrawal with their checking account. And usually they're a little bit more comfortable with that, because that'll be reflected on their financial statements. They have control over stopping it or anything like that. So that's one very specific action I would suggest.
That's great. Very helpful, both of you. And if I just tag on to that, I think that's really good. And also, if some people may be assuaged by learning a little bit more about how it works. They may not know enough about how it works. And in those cases, I would suggest finding out from your actual, whatever software program that you're using, how it handles security, what information they've already prepared to answer some of those questions, learning about that, and then sharing that information. So for those people who, if they knew a little bit more, they might feel comfortable. In those cases, that might be another strategy, which is really useful. It looks like Tonya Girardi's question was answered a little bit, Gianfranco, in terms of how to communicate transparently about financial information when there's a concern about being too public. So I think Karen Rosenberger's question here, which addresses community serving programs. Karen Rosenberger asks about how to restart programs they've had to close their food bank and their shared blessings meal because of many of the volunteers were high risk. I think this is something you spoke to, Sarah. So how can they restart this, or maybe work with different volunteers or different organizations to continue to serve in some of these ways?
Yes, I
Yeah,
know this.
so I would
Okay, Sarah, go ahead, please.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Sarah.
Yeah, so I would suggest, specifically for the local food bank, I would suggest getting in touch with the larger food bank that's coordinating distribution in your area. They usually have volunteer pools, or they're able to tap into volunteers that are younger, healthier, and may not be as high risk. I would also get into contact with the other feeding programs that you might be a part of. And I've seen in my neighborhood that people are just asking on like the community listservs or on Facebook and putting the call out there for volunteers, specifically because most of their regular volunteers are in that high risk group. So this is really a time to, reach out to your community partners and start building those networks and strengthening those networks, because you're right, a lot of these churches are doing programs on their own with the volunteers who are in that higher risk category.
Great. Gianfranco, did you want to add to that question?
No, Sarah responded very comprehensively, so that's yeah.
Great. It looks like we have a question from our good friend Theodore Debro at 16th Street Baptist. So I'll turn it over to you, Gianfranco. He has a question about who should do the direct ask, pastor, deacons, committee, or others.
First of all, let me say hi, Ted. It's good to have you with us, and wonderful place down there in Alabama. So yes, it's always good that it comes from the leadership. So the pastor should really be the person that is going to make the ask. Clearly, it depends. We have different congregation and different traditions. In some cases, for instance, in the Baptist world, you have very important, the trustee, maybe the chair of the trustee could be partnered with the pastor in doing the ask. Or you can create a leadership team. This is for everybody that would exercise those asks. It can be the pastor, the head of the parish council, the head of the deacons, or the head of the, or somebody that enjoys a universal, respect and, gratitude from the rest of the congregation. So that would be, but my advice also is to make an ask very simple. Don't ask too much, don't ask too little, ask what you think you can get. Look at their history of giving, what people have been donating so far, to make an ask that respond and respect what is that particular history of giving. So if your need, like I said before, is $25,000, and don't ask somebody who's been donating $100 a month for $25,000. On the other hand, if somebody is donating $25,000 every month, don't ask for $100. So base your ask on the information that you have, but please keep those information very private, very secure, just for the pastor and the treasurer maybe of the congregation.
Great. Thanks, Gianfranco. And another really good, I think this is an important question that Norman Eckstedt asks. So he says that the church has received two $100,000 estate gifts, and the funds have been left to the church for them to determine how to use them best through the parish council. These gifts will likely go to operations, and Norm's fear is that parishioners will now feel that their needs don't seem as critical to the parishioners. So his question is, how do we communicate the importance of supporting now, and that these legacy gifts can be better used for much more needed capital projects? So how can we use this money for capital projects and ask parishioners to continue their support for the annual operating budget? A great question, yes. Norman, thank you.
Yes, thank you. It's indeed a great question, and it's a timely question, but it's a question I hear all the time. So look, when you go buy a car, you probably you will still go to a bank and have a loan to buy the car. You don't pay the car, cash, and the same, even if you have the money. So to have received the gift, to have received the money, to have received a bequest and so forth, it doesn't mean that you have to squander that, but especially it doesn't mean for the rest of the congregation to be complacent about it and say, well, we have this money now, and why we have to ask, and why we have to have a stewardship campaign, and why we have to have a capital campaign. Absolutely not. Even if, excuse me, even if the money that you have received unexpectedly there was a planned giving type of situations, is great. It's a good amount of money. Still ask, never stop asking. It's a never-ending process in good times and in bad times. So if you have received an amount of money, well, that's the way and the time to be prudent about. Maybe you can decide, you as a congregation and the parish council and so forth, maybe you can decide to withdraw a little bit of that, but not as much. But this is not an excuse for the rest of the congregation to say, okay, we are fine, and so I don't have to give. Every gift must be a sacrificial gift. Without that, too many congregations would be in trouble. If there is a lesson that we have learned from this dramatic experience, we are still learning, is that things can happen. Bad things can happen. And let's also learn how to face them and keep sharing that it is ultimately the answer that we have. We might not give 100 like we could done it before. Maybe we can give only 50, but let's keep giving, let's keep giving, and let's keep giving.
Yeah, and I just want to say on top of that, this is something that we've seen with churches and synagogues and mosques, right, that have had some sort of large bequest. There is a sense that people's gift is no longer needed, and in that kind of situation, it's really important, again, for the clergy and the faith leaders in the congregation to emphasize that giving is more than just about, meeting some sort of financial need that the church has, right? Giving is a spiritual discipline, and it helps us have a right relationship with money, right? And so we don't want to stop that just because the utility bills are taken care of and payroll is taken care of, or some project is taken care of because of an unexpected bequest.
You can still help others if you have extra money, it's like Sarah's suggestion. If you receive a check, a stimulus check, and you don't really need it, you can donate it. So it's the same things. If you receive a bequest and you organize, another fundraising effort of your annual stewardship allows you to be generous. And there is actually, Joshua, you were asking me a story, an example. I'm going to share with you one. I don't want to say the name of the church, of course, but I can tell it's in Michigan, and I can tell it's an Episcopal church. And I was very touched when they shared with me that they've received a very generous, extremely, in the 7-figure bequest. And they decide to take an amount of that money and give that, donate to other parishes in the community that were not so lucky, that they, were struggling. So the sharing of gifts, to be in the true cycle of abundance, it was wonderful. That's a beautiful story.
That is great. Thank you so much for sharing that, Gianfranco. And that was a good reminder. I would want to add, if it's okay with my co-presenters, because I love this question. From a spiritual perspective, I heard it once described, and I think this is by Canon Charles Lafond, who's written a number of books on stewardship, including Fearless Fundraising. And Canon Lafond described this in sort of a way. I think this was from him, so maybe I'm misattributing this. But if we take a situation like that and say, well, somebody else is stepping in, I don't have to give, what we've essentially done is robbed that person of the opportunity to learn how to be generous, to grow in their faith through their generosity. Remember, this is a part of a spiritual practice and a spiritual discipline for people. And if you leave it to others, you're robbing that person, or yourself in that case, of your opportunity to learn how to give and to be generous. And so you're actually taking a spiritual opportunity away from someone. So I just wanted to share that because I thought of that too. It doesn't take don't take your chance away to learn how to be a more faithful giving person. We do have one last question, it looks like, here from our good friend Drew Henry in Albuquerque. Their congregation, of course, has an important level of income that comes from their community partners who use and share their space. None of those groups are able to now use the facility, so they've seen this income dry up. So this is a question on the revenue side of things, but a really important question. This question, I think, actually, I can jump in and then start, and Gianfranco and Sarah, please jump in as you want. This question has come up in another conversation that Partners is a part of, focused on managing vacant buildings, actually. We're managing closed buildings now that a lot of buildings are sort of partially closed in this strange state. And one of the things that we have started to suggest is having a conversation with some space users. So first of all, the congregation should understand what the gap is that you're missing. Not necessarily that the congregation can fully make that up, has the capacity to, but they should understand what that gap is. That's really important for them. The second part is talking to those space sharers. Now, you are a renter, or you are a landlord rather, but you're also a nonprofit that does a lot of community serving work. So this is a little bit of a different relationship, and there might be a possibility based on the organization and what their resources are of a potential to still contribute. They may not be able to pay what they were paying, but could they make a contribution knowing that that income helps sustain your budget as a community asset, as a community serving organization? Of course, that depends. You know, some organizations are not using your space because they can't meet, but they still have their resource. They still have much of their resources. Others can't meet in your space and aren't making money. So they may have very little to give to anyone, even to sustain their own staff and employees. So that may be a situation where they can't give anything. So I think it's a little bit talking to them and understanding case by case where they are and having a conversation and saying, you know, that what you provide to us through your space use, you know, sustains a community serving organization. We know you may not have resources, but we'd just love to talk about where you are, of course. And I think obviously that has to be a carefully managed conversation, because you don't want to give an unhelpful impression of a landlord looking for rent, because that's not what you're looking for. This is a partnership, and it's different. Right. So I invite Gianfranco and Sarah to jump in here.
Yes, yeah, you know, this is a situations where you have to think that we all are into this together. And if you've been you know, I use a word that Joshua used, landlord in a sense, but you're more than that. You're sharing your asset. And your asset is the building, and your asset is the hall that you have. Your asset is the gymnasium, whatever it might be. So you're sharing the asset with a nonprofit organization. I think there is nothing wrong to go to them and have a conversation like Joshua is suggesting about, can you, you know, I give you an example. I am a member of, this is nothing to do with churches, but I am a member of a club, you know, a pool, and I like to swim, and I'm a member of this club. And so they, at the beginning of this, they wrote us and they said, can you still pay something, because so we can pay our people, because obviously the gym and the pool are closed. For those that can do that, yes, I said yes, I would pay half of my fee, you know, the monthly fee. And so some sort of arrangement like that, I think, can be reached. But we go back to what we were saying at the very beginning of our webinar. So really be open and talk. Be open and ask. Be open and don't be embarrassed. We are all in this together.
Sarah, did you want to add?
Yeah, so I think that affirming everything that y'all have said, I also think that if you haven't done so already, every finance committee should be having a very long meeting right now, going through all of your expenses, all of your income, because some of the income does come from things like space sharing, which is going to be hard to make up, right? So it'll be really important to go through and look at what expenses might decrease. I live in Chicago, as you can see behind me, and one of the things that we have been able to do is turn off a lot of the gas in my church, right? And so that bill has drastically decreased. And so it is kind of looking at where you have some give and take in the budget. You're going to have to get creative here. I'll also say that there are other forms of relief out there. Again, this is on an individual congregation by congregation basis. There might be other forms of relief depending on the kinds of programs you have or provide, kinds of activities that are in your building. that you might be able to find some sort of support from community organizations or finance groups or things like that. So I would encourage you to look for those kinds of support as well.
Great. Thanks to both of you. Those are really great answers. So it looks like that we've covered all of the questions that our great participants have shared with us. We're so grateful that you've been able to spend this time. And thanks to Gianfranco and Sarah for helping lead this presentation. Really wonderful to be able to present with you.
Thank you.
Thanks. And thanks to everybody who's asked questions. This was a very good discussion. I hope it was helpful for everyone. This isn't the end of the conversation though. We will be sending a follow-up message early next week with more opportunities and other webinars that partners will be offering related to how we continue to do our work and thrive in the midst of the response to this pandemic and crisis. If you have more questions about stewardship following this presentation, please be in touch with us. Please email any of the presenters here, and don't ever hesitate to reach out to anybody at Partners. We're always here, and the door is always open for your questions and anything that you need. There is a link, there should be a link to our website that will be in the chat box, and just a reminder that the slides and a recording of this presentation will be available early next week. Check your emails for that. We will send an email with a link to those things, or check our website and you should see it there early next week.
And Joshua, if I may just say the last things, you see our emails on the screen, our personal emails, I mean work-related emails, of course. So if you have any specific question of your particular situation that we were not able to cover because this has to be to some degree general conversation, please reach out individually to us and we will respond to you personally.
So thanks again, everyone, for being a part of this conversation. We're really glad that we could spend the time with you and share some of this information with you. And we hope to stay in touch, and all the best to everyone who's been able to attend today. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.